Welcome, everybody. My name is Nicholas Cullen, and I'm here to introduce our speaker for the day, Professor James Higham. He works or is a member of staff in the Department of Tourism, which is in the Otago Business School. He does a lot of different research on tourism and climate change. He's been doing that for over a decade. He has a particular interest in aviation emissions and sort of tourist decision making, and more broadly speaking, an interest in decarbonising tourism, which seems really relevant today, and especially in a place like New Zealand, which is takes a while to get down here, and considerations around decarbonisation seems really, really appropriate. The other very nice thing about James is that he was one of the founding members of OCNET and has really represented us in the climate change space for some time. So it's with great pleasure, James, we look forward to your talk today on decarbonising tourism.
All right. Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, everyone, for being here on such a lovely day when the weather forecast is pretty bad and when there are exams on and you should be studying if you're a student with exams coming up. I'm very grateful that you're here, and it's great to be able to acknowledge Colin Campbell-Hunt, who was the driving force behind OCNET back in the day. It's great to see you here, Colin, and thank you to Kate and to Sarah and various other current members of OCNET who are driving things forward with such energy and who make today possible. So thank you for your efforts. Thank you, Nicholas, for the introduction. Yes, decarbonising tourism is a particular interest of mine at the moment, and as Nicholas has said, I've kind of come from a particular focus on aviation that will probably be apparent as I work through this presentation. Here's roughly what I want to achieve in the next half an hour or so. Hopefully I won't take too much more than that amount of time, because it would be great to get some questions and discussions going, because what I want to share with you today is very much thoughts in progress about how we can begin to tackle decarbonisation of the New Zealand tourism industry. It's an enormous challenge, and there are people in this room who have been thinking about this in one way or another for a long time, and it's a shame that their efforts weren't supported a decade ago or more, but better late than never. We need to get on with this. So I want to talk a little bit about the problem, which in a nutshell is the energy intensity of the tourism industry. It's very energy intensive, and we need to do something about that despite the problems of being far, far, far away from our key markets. I want to talk a little bit about climate conscious tourism policy and how we can start moving in that direction. And in that vein, I want to talk a little bit about measurement and mitigation, and MBCM, which stands for market-based carbon management, which is an idea that we're playing with at the moment, and as I say, very much thoughts in progress at this stage. So the problem is, again, a bit of an aviation focus here to start with, but tourism more broadly is very dependent on cheap energy that is driving climate change. So we can see here that transportation currently accounts for around 23% of total global energy-related CO2 emissions. Transportation is enormous, and obviously tourism is part of this challenging domain. Part of the problem with tourism and part of the problem with transportation is that it's accelerating. It's projected to double over the next few decades, as it has in recent decades. Air travel in particular produces a large and growing proportion of CO2 emissions globally. It's really problematic because there's no low carbon alternative to flying. If you want to fly, you're going to be putting emissions into the upper atmosphere at a great rate. So we do have a problem here, given that other sectors, other industries are actively mitigating their emissions. Tourism has been very slow out of the blocks. In terms of aviation, global passenger demand is growing at 5 to 6% per annum. That means it's doubling every 18 to 20 years. And it's been doing that since 1970, and it shows no sign of letting up. And Boeing and Airbus talk very ambitiously about how many planes are going to be flying in the skies above us in 2030, 2040, 2050. So in a nutshell, tourism is high carbon. And these points summarize some of the challenges that we have in front of us. Our tourism industries tend to be dependent on high carbon transportation modes. The highest emitting transportation modes tend to be the ones that are growing the fastest. There's increasing demand for high-speed, long-haul, typically short turnaround tourism. It's a formula that we've developed in recent decades that is completely unsustainable. Air travel has been omitted from meaningful global efforts to mitigate emissions. Some efforts have been made, and certainly in terms of aviation, they've failed to date. Production and consumption, transportation, shopping, food consumption, these are key sectors. Tourism is implicated in high emissions through these sectors. Of course, the situation is particularly acute when you're situated in the middle of a vast ocean and your key markets tend to be on the other side, out of frame, flying vast distances, not just long haul, but multiple long haul. According to the definitions of long haul, our visitors tend to be multiple long haul or extreme long haul visitors just to get here. Interestingly, this is a clipping from a newspaper in Germany just 6 weeks ago or so. My friend and colleague Susanna Becken sent me this clipping, said I would probably be quite interested in this. This is a newspaper feature article that presents comparative images of places far, far away from Germany, like Milford Sound at the top, and places very close to Germany where you can experience similar sorts of places, like in Norway, where they have awesome fjords, as we all know. And the idea here is to say to readers in Germany, actually, you don't have to feel guilty about flying all the way to the other side of the world to visit places like New Zealand, because there are equally nice places to visit right on your doorstep. So start thinking about distance and start acting responsibly in terms of your individual carbon footprint. And that kind of leads me to this article that was published in May last year. There's a little bit of a story behind this article, because in June, the following month, 2018, I visited the University of Queensland and I gave a talk on aviation emissions. And I featured this article, which had just been published in Nature Climate Change, and outlined some of the key findings in this paper and expressed the importance of this paper, not realizing that the second author, Ya-Yen Sun, was actually sitting in the audience. She had recently been recruited to University of Queensland from Taiwan, and when it came to Q&A, one person put their hand up and said, "Are you aware that Ya-Yen is sitting right next to me?" And so I was in Brisbane for a couple of weeks, and Ya-Yen and I struck up a really good conversation, had a few lunchtime meetings and started talking about decarbonisation more broadly. So this paper, here's the abstract. It had just been published at the time, and it outlined some really very, very important points. It outlined, for example, that the carbon footprint of global tourism, based on an analysis of 160 countries around the world, was in fact much higher than had previously been calculated. And you can see here some of the key points around transportation, shopping, and food as significant contributors to the carbon footprint of global tourism. The majority of this footprint is exerted by high-income countries, and in fact, particularly amongst high-income people within certain high-income societies. So tourism is not evenly distributed at all. I read recently that 75% of all flights in Britain were taken by British people, are taken by 15% of the population. And 50% of the UK population doesn't fly in any given year. So it's actually not just the high-income countries, but it's the high-income people within those high-income countries. We see increases in demand way outstripping decarbonisation efforts in terms of tourism-related technologies. So energy efficiency in aviation has become more and more marginal over time. Over the same period, demand for aviation has taken off. So some really important points that came out of this paper, recognizing that the high carbon intensity and continuing growth in tourism will represent an ever-increasing proportion of global emissions as tourism continues this relentless march. So, a lot of my work over the last decade has looked at individuals like me and other people, tourists, and how they are internalizing climate change and if they are responding in terms of their consumer decision making. And over the course of those years, I became more and more despondent, I suppose, disillusioned, because I found that when we were engaged in studies of tourists, most were really concerned about climate change, but very few were actually doing anything about it for all sorts of reasons, all sorts of excuses why they were concerned, but continued to behave without any change in their behavior. And of course, I've increasingly sensed my own personal guilt because I'm acutely aware of the problem, but you know, I still changed my behaviors in some ways, but I still have a very heavy personal carbon footprint. So these points I think are really important. In the last 2 or 3 years, and particularly in conversation with several colleagues here at Otago, James McLaurin, Lisa Ellis, and others, I've become convinced that tourism and indeed the high carbon transport regime is very hard to step back from. It's very hard to kind of discontinue. So high carbon transportation is a social convention that entrenches suboptimal social and environmental outcomes for everyone. The problem is that if we individually step out of that regime, we personally may feel a little bit better about that, but there are huge costs associated with simply stepping aside from the social convention while everyone else continues to, nothing else changes. You know? So the key point of a paper that I published with Lisa and James last year is that transition from the high carbon air travel regime or transitioning away from high carbon tourism requires coordination. We cannot rely on individuals acting upon their concerns when the social convention remains unchanged. And this kind of brings me back to Higham, because when we started talking about climate conscious tourism policy, we had a lot of concerns. So for example, the United Nations has given us the Paris Climate Accord and it's given us the SDGs. But within the United Nations framework, the World Tourism Organization continues to push tourism as really important to our economies and you know, relatively benign sector in terms of environmental externalities. And again, within that framework, the International Civil Aviation Organization has spent quite a few decades now saying that it's going to do something about aviation emissions, and even post-2015 in the Paris Climate Agreement has come up with CORSIA, which really is a failure to address aviation emissions. We have the World Travel and Tourism Council, which for many years now has really pushed the rigorous measurement of economic impacts of tourism for national governments around the world, member states, but have completely ignored the environmental and social costs of tourism. We have a New Zealand government now that's recently released a new tourism strategy that says we need a whole of government approach to this, not a ministry like MB or formerly the Tourism Ministry, working alongside Tourism New Zealand and 1 or 2 other immediate actors. We need all of government involved in this. So we need to recognise net zero carbon 2050 legislation and draw that in to these tourism actors. We have Tourism New Zealand, which for many decades now has been pursuing through 100% pure aggressive growth in tourism markets, measured in numbers of visitors. You know, for a long time, Tourism New Zealand has talked about you know, mature markets and emerging markets and engine markets and high growth markets and all sorts of different markets at different stages of the market life cycle. So it's been all about numbers, and it's been all about growth. And when it comes to climate conscious tourism policy, that hasn't really been on the agenda. However, things are now changing. The climate is definitely changing. We have government ministries, we have industry organisations, we have tourism businesses, we have regional tourism organisations that are now saying, yes, we have been slow out of the blocks, but better late than never. Let's get on with this important job. So this is particularly the focus of Yi Yen's work. She's a tourism economist, and for quite a number of years, she's been working in this sort of space, working with national accounts to try and understand not just the economic impacts of tourism, but increasingly the other impacts of tourism. And so I just want to briefly overview this framework that might lead us towards increasingly climate-conscious tourism policy in New Zealand and perhaps elsewhere around the world. So there are 4 pillars in this model. The first pillar looks at the carbon footprint of national tourism consumption. And a key indicator here, of course, will be the CO2 footprint of tourism in New Zealand. So what we have here is the idea that there's been a lack of attention paid to this. And of course, tourism is very hard to define as a sector. This has been a problem for a long time. And particularly international emissions, really hard to nail down where responsibility lies, how we allocate those emissions. But the fact is that we haven't had a benchmark of carbon tourism CO2 emissions in New Zealand, and it's long overdue. So part of our thinking here is to develop a database, a time series database that can be updated quarterly, periodically, whatever the time frame might be, so we can actually measure the carbon footprint of tourism and measure it over time to see how things are trending. This requires us to measure tourism's contribution to the national CO2 inventory in terms, relative terms, but also in absolute terms. Secondly, we need to start thinking about tourism carbon efficiency. So here we start talking about not just GDP from tourism, but also CO2 and the relationship between $1 of GDP and the carbon footprint associated with generating that $1 of GDP. So we need to explore the link between tourism income and emissions. And we need to pursue tourism consumption in alignment with steadying and then declining energy demands. Paul Peters has told us for a number of years that the current trends are for increasing carbon footprint per dollar earned for GDP, driven by tourists who are traveling further, engaging in luxury experiences, increasingly reliant on aviation, and increasingly traveling for shorter and shorter timeframes, less time at the destination for increasing carbon footprint. So we need to think about carbon efficiency in tourism, and that's the second pillar. The third pillar is to establish a trajectory to start to scale back on the carbon footprint of tourism. And this will require benchmarking and measurement over time. Currently, any talk around tourism decarbonisation is focused on technology and operational gains and relatively small efficiency gains that, as I say, particularly in aviation, but in other parts of tourism, become more and more marginal and fractional. So we need research to think about how we can start stabilising and then tracking down. And fourthly, the fourth key pillar is to benchmark tourism against other sectors. Again, we haven't been doing this. We need to know how $1 of tourism GDP compares in terms of CO2 with other sectors of the economy, to see how we compare, to see how we stack up, and to inform urgency, relative urgency. Yi Yen and I have started looking into this, and it doesn't look so good for tourism. The initial analyses are telling us that this is a high priority sector for decarbonisation. And if that's the case, and this, as I say, is kind of very early days and work in progress, we need to really start thinking about regulatory instruments, market-based instruments, these various things that we might want to start thinking of doing to reduce the carbon footprint of tourism. And that leads me to where I tend to be leading the conversation alongside Higham, and that is market-based carbon management. So if we're going to try and change the system, if we're going to try and change the social convention, if you like, we need to start working together. And I think that market-based carbon management might be an approach, at least an approach to consider immediately. So historically, tourism development has focused on maximisation, tourism maximisation. Currently and historically, governments have pursued growth in tourism arrivals in the interests of economic outputs. And that is still very much the case today. Of course, the social and environmental byproducts of tourism are rarely mentioned. However, they're becoming increasingly front and centre when you think about growing global concerns around climate change, and when you think about some of the growing regional concerns around over-tourism, where destinations are being completely swamped by tourists that are changing their day-to-day routines, their day-to-day lifestyles, their qualities of life. So we're now confronted with over-tourism and loss of so-called social license, and that's when host communities eventually say, enough is enough, we're exhausted by tourism, we don't want any more, something's got to give. So, tourism maximisation will need to balance economic data with social and environmental data. The alternative approach, which is now quite well established in the literature, is called tourism optimisation. And optimisation is based on market segmentation and analysis, where we look at discrete tourism markets, visitor origins. We look at discrete sectors of the industry like aviation and hospitality, food, accommodation, etc. And we think about how we might optimize rather than maximize. And optimization can take several forms. Susanna Becken's work a decade ago focused on economic stability. We can maximize our markets with interests in economic stability, because we've seen some destinations that have relied too heavily on some markets, and when those markets have crashed, and sometimes they crash literally overnight, the destination is left in ruins, often for reasons completely beyond their control. An example in New Zealand was the East Asian financial crisis of 1997, 1998. At the time, we had received increasing numbers of visitors from Japan and Taiwan, and as those economies began to collapse, our industry really suffered. We can talk about seasonal optimization. We can try and optimize length of stay. Stefan Gosling, more recently, has been talking about optimizing carbon and thinking about the carbon footprint of our visitor arrivals. So, optimization is primarily intended to increase the value of tourism. And this changes the formula quite radically. It may be used to address problems of over-tourism and compromised social license. It might be used in a way that requires us to actually stabilize and possibly reduce total visitor arrivals. That hasn't been part of the conversation yet, although increasingly, in some circles, we're hearing talk about how many is too many. In New Zealand, we're moving very rapidly towards 5 million visitors a year. And we moved, through the 2s, 3s to 4 millions very quickly. So do we want 5 million? And if so, we're probably going to get 5 million around 2023, 2024. And what does that mean for 2030 or 2040? How many tens of millions might we want? So the alternative is to optimize our markets. And optimization, as you see at the bottom of this slide, seeks to address economic benefits, social license, and environmental sustainability. So the analytical framework that we've started to play with involves several steps. So firstly, in terms of an analytical framework that accommodates CO2 and tries to bring CO2 down, thinks about, for example, our destination visitor mix and whether we need to engineer our visitor mix and perhaps even particular sectors or subsectors of the tourism industry to encourage lower emission markets, perhaps even actively demarket the markets that have the heaviest carbon footprint per dollar of GDP. Obviously in New Zealand, aviation accounts for a very high proportion of visitor carbon intensity. So obviously we can start profiling our markets in terms of distance travelled and CO2 generated, CO2 emissions per visitor arrival. The gravity model tells us that we tend to trade with our nearest proximal trading partners, which is part of the argument against Brexit. You know, why would you turn your back on Europe when the vast majority of your trade is conducted with Europe? It doesn't make sense. In tourism, we know through the work of Inga and Craig Roger in physics that there is an inescapable link under current technology between how far tourists come and the CO2 emission profile of those markets. Australia provided, when this study was conducted in 2009, 37% of all our arrivals and 13% of aviation CO2. Europe, 18% of arrivals and 43%. This inescapable relationship between distance and carbon intensity. So we can start thinking about intermarket carbon intensities, and Stefan Gosling's work has focused on this. He identifies that intermarket carbon intensities vary very, very significantly across 11 global destinations. And if we think about intermarket carbon intensity in the New Zealand context, we can start identifying these sorts of variables. The most important, as I just mentioned, is distance from market, with the most carbon intensive being our extreme or multiple long haul markets through medium, short haul, international, right down to domestic. A huge proportion of the CO2 footprint of New Zealand tourism is New Zealanders flying away, yeah, which is a leakage of tourist expenditure from our economy. Okay, of course, our lowest carbon footprint visitor markets will be those who don't actually have to fly at all, domestic tourists. Interestingly, Tourism New Zealand has now been charged by the government to collect data and to analyse domestic tourism demand, not to market to those domestic visitors, but to start collecting data. Historically, until this year, Tourism New Zealand has focused only on international markets. So maybe things are beginning to shift there. Length of stay. We have some international visitors who spend literally a few hours in New Zealand. They come all this way and they spend very little time here. For example, international cruise passengers who tend to fly all the way around the world into Auckland. They get on a cruise ship that sailed all the way from somewhere else to cruise around the New Zealand coastline. They get on the cruise ship and they do short excursions, and then they're back on board the ship. So they're literally at the destination for a very short period of time. Of course, we have other tourists who may be here for weeks or months. And relative to the carbon footprint of getting here, their CO2 per dollar GDP is much, much lower. Mode of domestic transportation, from cruise and aviation through to electric camper vans and bicycles. Visitor activities, purpose of travel, levels of consumption, from luxury through to, backpacking and staying in people's homes and eating locally and perhaps being seasonally employed in a particular region. Very, very different carbon footprint. So this is what we call inter-market carbon intensity. Perhaps we need to start thinking about this. What we can then do is start thinking about our empirical variables. And the idea here is that we might have two foundational variables. They are GDP, economic yield, and CO2, the carbon outputs of tourism. But then we may begin to analyze tourism and our tourism markets in relation to additional variables. How long tourists stay here, what sort of transportation modes they use, what forms and levels of consumption they engage in. And we can start thinking about additional variables, and we might even go down to quite specific variables like spatial travel flows. Government collects really good data on visitor arrivals and how they disperse or concentrate in various tourism regions around the country. We have regions such as Queenstown that are bursting at the seams, and we have the airport authority saying we need to, greatly increase aircraft arrivals into Queenstown to accommodate this demand. But we have other regions that have very little tourism and are crying out for more tourism to support their regional economies. And some markets are here for a very short period of time and they tend to concentrate, and others that spend longer perhaps disperse more through the country. There are debates around concentration and dispersal, but they certainly relate to social impacts around infrastructure demands and resource capacity constraints, visitor experience, host community social license. So perhaps we need to be thinking about these sorts of quite specific variables. The analytical framework could be tested using hypothetical examples initially, perhaps with different levels of complexity, from very simple complexity that focuses perhaps on the foundational variables to increasing complexity that accommodates additional and specific variables that may then inform policy. The idea here is that different levels of complexity might give very different results. So we need to be very cautious here and think about different levels of complexity, different results, and different possible policy recommendations arising. And then, of course, the fourth step is to think very carefully about our guiding questions. What might we use market-based carbon management to achieve? And here are four key questions that our government is no doubt thinking about and perhaps wants to advance in terms of who are the high carbon emitters and what are the differences between the high and low carbon impacts per tourist or per market segment. These are the sorts of questions that we would want to inform our analytical framework to make sure that this isn't purely an academic exercise, but it's actually linked to government policy priorities and business sector initiative to try and stabilise and reduce carbon emissions. So here's a bit of a summary framework. We're trying to move from focus explicitly on GDP to environment and social. We can measure economic, environmental and social outcomes of tourism. We can analyse them by segment, and we can model those using market-based carbon management that may require interventions that perhaps disturb business as usual. So we can think about what the future might look like for New Zealand tourism under business as usual. Most of our forecasts, and there are some interesting forecasts, tourism through to 2025 and beyond, they're based on business as usual. But what about if we engage in interventions to try and focus on a new marketing mix that may have these all in mind? So obviously these planning and policy outcomes would need to be informed by the key priorities of government and business. So we need to be thinking about this, what the current situation looks like under business as usual, but then to incorporate what we call objective and constraint variables, more on that in just a minute, to achieve desired outcomes that it seems that government and industry are increasingly concerned about and increasingly looking for research and policy leadership on. So here are some ideas around objective, constraint and decision variables. The idea here in this summary table is that we can start with relatively low to medium and high complexity. The objective variables are the variables that the outcomes that we really want to achieve, most simply around CO2 emissions. The constraint variables are the conditions that governments may say have to be met. So we might say that tourist visitor volume should remain constant. Doesn't necessarily have to increase, but we don't want it to decrease. Or we could increase levels of complexity in our analysis through to decision variables, which are the variables that we can manipulate and the things that we can perhaps model and use to inform policy interventions based on these different levels of complexity. So here we focus only on CO2 relative to GDP, but then we can move to higher levels of analytical complexity around seasonality, for example, length of stay, visitor spending per by visitor market, and the sorts of interventions that may be required to try and move us in these sorts of directions. And then again, the intervention strategies by government, by business, and perhaps by the local scale, civic society, local business owners and such like, maybe around these sorts of things to try and move down this pathway of optimization rather than maximization. Last slide for me for today is a plug. Well, just to mention really that in this year in March, we hosted our first inaugural tourism policy school in Queenstown. The focus of the tourism policy school was on tourism sustainability, volume versus value. It was well received by key policymakers and businesses, business leaders, local government, regional tourism organisations, and such like. So we have quickly moved to make this an annual event. The second annual tourism policy school will be in March 2020, and we're going to focus on decarbonisation and how we can move tourism onto a sustainable emissions path. It's an enormous challenge, but we've got some good support, sponsorship from Tourism Holdings Limited, Air New Zealand, Destination Queenstown, some of the really big players in the tourism industry that realise that, yes, we have been slow out of the blocks, but as I said before, better late than never. And we need to really be moving forward on this front. There you go. Thank you for your attention.
We have some time for questions, and if someone would like to ask a question, I'll just bring the microphone forward so we can all hear it, and it will be also on the video cast.
What about cruise ships? What about cruise ships coming to Dunedin?
Yeah, so I mean, it fits very much within what I've said, and I've already mentioned cruise ships to an extent. The current approach is very much tourism maximisation. We read in the media, we read in our local newspaper that the number of cruise ships is increasing, and the volume of those cruise ships is increasing. The cruise ships are getting bigger. We're seeing more cruise ships arriving. Obviously, if we look to places like Venice, we see problems of over-tourism and compromised social license. We see local communities actually protesting against cruise ships and expressing their concerns for the fact that these cruise passengers, and there may be literally thousands and thousands of cruise passengers that disgorge in the morning and take over a place like Venice, really compromising the quality of life of local residents. It's a classic example. We have debates in New Zealand around whether Ports of Auckland should extend into the harbour and further encroach its footprint into the Waitemata harbour to accommodate ever larger cruise ships. And there's a really contentious debate around that. Some argue that we simply cannot lose the opportunity to receive increasing numbers of cruise passengers into our inner city. And there are others who say we don't want to compromise our harbour, and the passengers are typically here for a relatively short duration, and the economic impacts of those visitors is kind of undeclared. You know, we honestly don't know. We need to know more about the cruise sector. We need to know more about various sectors in tourism, and cruise is definitely one of them. I think that we need to be more critical in our engagement with these sorts of debates. There's no question that cruise has a very high carbon footprint. Again, Inga has done some work on the cruise industry. Correct me if I'm wrong, Inga, a study that compared aviation arrivals, CO2, and what the CO2 footprint would look like if all of those international arrivals to New Zealand arrived by cruise ship, and it would be higher. Yeah. So yeah, this is one sector that should be part of this sort of approach. Absolutely. So I think the guy behind was next.
A carbon tax would introduce a gradient between activities so that the high impact helicopter flights and the cheap bikes trade off. And same in terms of the balance between consumption of food, the food sector, the accommodation sector. So the Productivity Commission recommendation, or the German model of introducing a carbon tax, would mean there's a gradient, so we start moving towards these places, because it's very difficult to do it by regulation and have an even output. So does that seem to be a central part of the policy?
I think it certainly needs to be on the table. It needs to be on the agenda. What form that tax would take, and what the consequences of such an approach would be important to consider. We did a study 3 years ago on the introduction of a carbon tax in domestic Australian aviation. That carbon tax ran through 2012, all of 2013 and part of 2014. So there's about 2 years of data. And the analysis looked at pre-tax, during tax and post-tax. I think the Australian tax on domestic aviation was costed at 24 Australian dollars per tonne, and it had absolutely no effect, sadly. The reason for that was that the domestic airline industry in Australia was so competitive that the airlines actually refused to pass the tax on to their customers. They incorporated the tax and wished it away. It became a federal government policy issue, and there was a change of government in the following federal election, and the carbon tax disappeared. So it's really important to make sure that the taxing regime is appropriate. It's also really important to bear in mind that governments are very nervous about taxing, obviously, because as the Australian example shows, it's very easy to make tax a political football. So I think it's got to be on the table. It's got to be something to be considered.
The shift the cost in some things of predatory consideration of litigation, and if it's intelligent, if somebody doesn't pay tax.
Yeah. I agree. The fact is that a lot of our consumption now does not obviously accommodate environmental cost, which will be borne by future generations. So I agree with your point.
Hey, I was just wondering what you thought is sort of the flow between consumers, businesses, and government in terms of who needs to take action sort of first.
Yeah.
Because will businesses not change unless consumers start making different decisions, or will consumers not make those different decisions until they have really good alternative options? And how does government play into that? Just wondering where you think that flow sort of works.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I can't answer it. It's a bit of a chicken and egg question. In our studies of tourists, we've found that the majority have been very slow to act, but some have been really inspiring in terms of their actions. But for example, when it comes to carbon offsetting, very, very few people chose initially to offset their flight CO2 emissions. So really slow. So that's consumers, that's individual action. In terms of the industry, there are actually some amazing things going on in tourism now. I mentioned Tourism Holdings Limited, which is really quite aggressively trying to shift its approach to accommodate carbon. It's been really driving forward with electric campervan design. Now has an electric campervan fleet, and I've spoken with Tourism Holdings Limited, and they're really, really mindful and committed to tackling this problem. Same with governments. It's been hard for governments to make meaningful change, but perhaps now. Again, I get the feeling that, just in the last year, 2 years, I've seen lots of drivers of growing concern and obviously increasing action. Whilst our focus has been on individuals, it's clear that individuals, industry and government all have to be on board. And that's what we refer to as collective action to change the social convention.
It seems to me that the principal problem that you've raised is burning fossil fuel. Must be 90% or more of the issue. What research is being undertaken worldwide to get some alternative method of shifting people from A to B without burning oil in some shape or form?
Well, it's a great question. It's a very, very difficult question because, as I've mentioned, our global tourism production system is really based on aviation. And therein lies an enormous challenge because we are limited by current technology. And there have been various promises made by airline manufacturers over recent decades about breakthroughs, technical breakthroughs, but none have come to fruition. And the reality is that any breakthrough, any silver bullet solution in technical terms, as far as aviation is concerned, is decades away at best, given the timeframes involved in developing these technologies and bringing them to market. So aviation has, as I say, really exhausted its technical advances in terms of energy efficiency. Under current technologies, there's no solution on the horizon. In fact, just to go off on a slight tangent, but perhaps a relevant one, since 2002, we've seen less and less advances in terms of civil aviation technology development and rapidly accelerating advances in space travel, which is being driven by a very small number of so-called space billionaires, Elon Musk, Richard Branson, Jeff Bezos, and others, who have very, very aggressive ambitions around getting tourists into space. Richard Branson has said that suborbital flight for tourists will use the same technologies required for point-to-point travel across the Earth's surface. So a suborbital flight might take off from New York and descend and land in Tokyo 70 minutes later, which completely redefines the spatio-temporal limits of human transportation across Earth's surface. A paper published in Nature in 2007 or 2009, thereabouts, estimated that 1,000 rocket launches would have the same carbon footprint of the entire aviation industry in that year. No sign of technical breakthroughs that are going to come to our rescue most immediately, and perhaps we should become increasingly concerned of new social conventions that are being developed by the so-called space billionaires.
James, what about biofuels? Jumping in, but
Yeah. Yeah, again, I mean, we're talking now about lots of initiatives and lots of potential ideas. Biofuels. Air New Zealand was, I think, the first commercial national flag-carrying airline in the world to trial biofuels over 10 years ago. They come with environmental costs as well. You know, growing crops for biofuel production to allow us to continue to fly around the world when people are starving and when we've got limited water resources. Lots of big ethical questions there as well. Carolyn.
Hang on, I'm just going to...
oh, sorry.
We're just coming to a question.
Sorry, Carolyn, I'm not in control here. Sorry, Nicholas.
Thank you, James. This was a very interesting presentation, and I'm an admirer of your work. Just one question sideways. One of the reasons why we need to grow the economy is because we have to employ people. So it's the capacity building. So it's all very well to have the ability to measure and to say, yes, we've got to change. But how are we going to develop platforms to assimilate young people from getting into the employment, into the labor force? And two, I mean, this is going to sound a little bit tricky, is it worthwhile to encourage an additional intense use of AI and VI where you go into these incredible land space stations and you are experiencing New Zealand, even though you're in Paris.
Yeah, right. So-called virtual tourism. Thank you, Fernanda. They're really, really interesting and important questions. I've tried to give some emphasis to the economic importance of tourism. And the last thing that tourism optimization seeks to do is to undermine the important economic contributions of tourism. Tourism is really important to countries like New Zealand and many other countries around the world. So yeah, optimization is about value. It's about optimizing the value of tourism. Optimization may allow us to be more efficient in how we engineer tourism to maximize its economic gain, its economic contribution, but also to begin to internalize and account for social and environmental costs. When it comes to young people, I agree, you know, it's a really challenging question. When you started talking about younger generations, I thought you were going to talk about aeromobility you know, equity in terms of increasingly limited capacities to fly given carbon constraints, and how we allocate that in the future across generations, which leads us into really interesting questions around differences between countries as well. Because at the moment we have this flight shame movement in Sweden and increasingly elsewhere in Europe, which are very mature aeromobile societies. But flight shame isn't going to work in other contexts. So for example, speaking recently to students in Asia, Vietnam, China, where there's absolutely no sense of flight shame around flying, but rather flying is seen as a huge signifier of social standing and success. And we have younger generations in those Asian countries that will show no propensity towards responding to flight shame, because they're much more recently arrived in terms of the amazing opportunities of being aeromobile. So extremely complex in those senses. I can't remember what the second part of your question was. Yeah.
It's an ethical issue. But the other one is
virtual.
about using virtual reality and AI to create these spaces where you really have a super duper experience.
Yeah.
So instead of spending a few $1,000s and God knows how many carbon.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, it's restricting your freedom. And I feel like ethically that's not either.
Yeah, yeah. So again, there are some open questions around virtual communications and virtual presence. I could talk at length about this. We've done some studies in recent years around academic mobility and transferability from corporeal or you know, physical travel to virtual communications and virtual conference attendance and virtual co-presence, as sociologists refer to it. There's actually not a lot of evidence to suggest that virtual travel does not drive further physical travel. In other words, we may be able to travel less to meetings in Wellington or to occasional meetings with colleagues overseas. We can meet with them via Skype or Zoom, etc. But if we attend conferences virtually, that may not require us to travel at that moment in time, but we continue to build and develop networks that may lead to future opportunities to travel physically. So the literature tells us that virtual substitution is not necessarily substitution to future physical travel. Something we could talk about at huge length.
Time just for one last quick question.
Is there time? Yeah. Okay,
Hi,
my quick question is, and it relates to some other questions that have been asked before. With respect to the cruise ships coming in, and I think we heard that they do have a high carbon footprint. It strikes me that if that carbon footprint is largely based on the fuel consumption and the type of fuel they're using, there seems a very large potential for those ships to be moved to some other form of travel. I mean, I'm not suggesting we leap into nuclear, but you know, ones that do not have the carbon footprint the same.
I'm no expert, I'm no physicist. Maybe Inge can answer this in more detail, but I would say that no doubt there's further scope for surface maritime than there is for aviation. Interestingly, Greta Thunberg recently traveled from Stockholm to New York, and she sailed across the North Atlantic on an eco yacht, which is pretty game for a 15 or 16-year-old, but an option that's unavailable to the vast majority of us, of course. There are other concerns around cruise in terms of the carbon footprint of consumption on board, for example, and waste disposal at sea. But there's huge variation across cruise companies, from smaller to much larger, in terms of their environmental practices, in terms of their commitment to making positive contributions to the environment. There are some cruise companies now that actively recruit their passengers to donate to environmental causes and to destinations that may have been afflicted by environmental disasters, and to help rebuilds and to help with poverty alleviation and so forth. So there are lots of variables involved here. But again, all worthy of our critical consideration.
Thank you very much, James. Before bringing this to a close, I would just like to remind people that we have a couple items here. If you're a postgraduate student and you would like to join a sort of a postgraduate climate change group, please come up and sign up. We're making a little push, bringing all the graduate students who've kind of got some interest in climate change together and aiming to meet and work collectively together. And then for those who aren't part of our sort of Otago Climate Change Network group, but would like emails or updates about what we've been up to, also feel free to come up and sign that, and we'll make sure that we send the information relevant to our activities. And then finally, James, thank you so much for a very, very interesting talk. Based on the engagement and interest from everyone here, you're really doing some fantastic work and very relevant work at the moment. I'm keen to talk more about it too. So thanks again, James, for today.